Richard Dawkins and many of his fellow atheists like to portray themselves as not believing in any God. However, the main message that he gives in this book is that he doesn't really want to believe in the God of the Bible. By introducing myths from other cultures that so obviously couldn't happen and placing them alongside the historical record taken from the Bible, he attempts to make the biblical account seem just as unlikely. He pretends that all creation stories are equal. Unfortunately, with all the creation stories apart from those found in the Bible, you would have trouble finding any people who actually believed that these accounts were really true, let alone people who could actually debate the issues scientifically, as many scientists who are Christians can. In the first chapter of Richard Dawkins' The Magic of Reality, he makes a very interesting statement. On page 24 and 25 he writes, "Of course, no one really believes that it would be possible to turn a frog into a prince or a pumpkin into a coach, but have you ever stopped to consider why such things would be impossible? There are various ways of explaining it. My favourite way is this. Frogs and coaches are complicated things with lots of parts that need to be put together in a special way, in a special pattern that can't just happen by accident. That's what complicated means. It's very difficult to make a complicated thing like a frog or a coach. To make a coach, you need to bring all the parts together in just the right way. You need the skills of a carpenter and other craftsmen. Coaches don't just happen by chance or by snapping your fingers and saying abracadabra. A coach has structure, complexity, working parts, wheels and axles, windows and doors, springs and padded seats. It would be relatively easy to turn something complicated like a coach into something simple, like ash for instance. It's easy to turn almost anything into ash. But no one could take a pile of ash or a pumpkin and turn it into a coach, because a coach is too complicated, and not just complicated, but complicated in a useful direction, in this case useful for people to travel in. Now, this is one of the most incredible statements ever made by Richard Dawkins. In this case, he is completely correct. A coach is too complicated to come about by accident. However, a coach is not that complicated compared to even the simplest life form. Cells have structure, a complex coding and encoding system, and working parts, which need to come together in just the right way. Humans have never been able to create any machine as complex as the simplest cell. Despite believing that something relatively simple like a coach could not come about by accident, Dawkins believes that a far more complicated living thing could come about by accident. You notice that when Dawkins tries to give an explanation as to how evolution works, he doesn't even attempt to answer where the first life form came from. He just assumes that it came about by some naturalistic means, despite having said that complex things don't just come about by accident. There is no scientific explanation at all explaining how life could come about by accident. Dawkins has an underlying assumption which he doesn't explain or defend, a belief that life first came about through some naturalistic means. This has nothing to do with science, but is blind faith, the very thing that he preaches against. Dawkins says that he doesn't believe in miracles or things that go against the laws of science, but then according to all our known laws of science, life does not come from non-life. Because of this, we see that the whole premise of this book is false. Dawkins does believe in myths just as much as anybody does. He believes in the myth of life coming about through some naturalistic process, and so he never really answers one of the major questions in this book. That is, the question, where do we come from? No one has ever discovered any instance when information has come about by itself without intelligence creating it. Information is not just confined to the physical. The DNA code that makes up our bodies could just as easily be represented by bits on a computer, letters in a book, or information stored on a DVD, and may easily be transferred one to another. But that DNA is full of information. Information that not only makes the hardware of everything about our physical bodies, but also the software to constantly keep our bodies functioning. Even the simplest life form has this complex information. Though Richard Dawkins has no scientific proof that information can come about by itself without intelligence creating it, he still believes that it can happen. Another fact that science has shown us is that energy must be added in a purposeful manner to keep information from deteriorating. That if left to itself, information always deteriorates. There is no known instance we have of information increasing without some intelligence purposefully adding it. When Richard Dawkins was asked in an interview whether he knew of any genetic mutation or evolutionary process which could be seen to increase the genetic information, he was totally stumped. To get from a single-celled organism to a human being requires a huge increase in information. Information that is needed to build and operate lungs, heart, arms and legs, the brain and many other functions. Dawkins has never given any scientific explanation as to where that increase in information comes from. His stories of evolution are nothing more than a modern-day myth made up to explain how we got here. Dawkins starts out on page 28 trying to explain evolution by showing how you could get frogs with longer legs. Since there can be a huge amount of genetic variation within a population of frogs, this example is something that is quite possible. In fact, in the Bible in Genesis 30, there is a similar example. However, all experimental evidence shows that there is always a limit to how much things can change. We could not breed frogs and get longer and longer legs until the frog had legs as long as a giraffe's legs. After all, this breeding is just a shuffling of the genetic information that is already there. Dawkins continues on page 29 with an example about newts, saying that by breeding those newts that were more frog-like, we could eventually change newts into frogs. He gives no explanation at all as to how the newts could get these frog-like characteristics. On page 30, he gives the standard evolutionist's trick. By giving an example that is quite possible, like getting frogs from frogs with slight variations, he then says that it must be possible for a fish to gradually become a monkey, given enough time. Nowhere does he explain as to what makes the genetic material change. The idea that Darwinian evolution or natural selection is behind the evolutionary process has long been abandoned by the scientists actually studying the issue. Scientists actually have no idea as to how evolution could occur. This fact is largely unknown by most people. Richard Dawkins' understanding of the Bible seems to be very lacking. He seems to think there are two conflicting creation accounts in the book of Genesis, whereas there is only one account that has been divided into chapter 1 and chapter 2. He also gets very mixed up between the biblical kinds and the species that we have today. He seems to think Adam would have had a tough time naming all the millions of species we have today. However, in the Bible, Adam is not asked to name any of the sea creatures or insects, which is where the majority of species come from. Also, many modern species can be grouped together into one biblical kind. Dogs, wolves, dingoes, and coyotes are all considered different species, but are all genetically related as a biblical kind. Grizzly bears and polar bears are also different species, but the same kind. These and many other examples show that the number of animals that Adam would have had to name in the Bible is really not that high. On page 57, he says that the Bible does not tell us why we have such a variety of animals. The Bible tells us that all animals reproduce according to their kinds. According to all of our scientific knowledge, that is exactly what happens. Cats reproduce and become cats, and dogs reproduce to become dogs, yet with a huge variety within the kinds. The original animals created by God contained a huge genetic variability, allowing them to adapt to various environments. Consider this example, which illustrates how natural selection really works. We start with some dogs that have genes for long and short hair. As they breed, some of the pups will have short hair, some long, and some will have medium-length hair. If after a while the population splits into two groups, one going to a cold climate and the other one going to a hot climate, what would we expect? The long-haired ones would survive in the cold climate, while in the hot climate, the short-haired ones would be better off. Eventually, the genes for short hair would be lost to those in the cold climate, while the genes for long hair would be lost to those in the hot climate. The two populations would end up looking quite different and may even be considered different species, but as we see, no evolution has gone on. The genetic information in the populations has decreased, not increased. Dawkins says that it is easy to turn a coach into a pile of ash. This shows that it is very easy to lose or destroy information, or take something from a more complex state to a less complex state. Whenever evolutionists try to give an actual observed example of evolution, they always give one that shows the shuffling or loss of information, never the increase of information needed to change one kind into another. The loss of wings, legs, eyes, or even tusks is often given as proof of evolution, but all these show a loss of information, just what we would expect to happen if the biblical account was true. In chapter 2, Who was the first person? On page 38, Dawkins talks about a thought experiment of a pile of 185 million pictures of ancestors stacked on top of each other. He describes these as going from a fish to a modern human, each only varying slightly from the one before. This is a completely hypothetical example, because the fossil record does not support this idea. The majority of the creatures in the pile of pictures exist only in the evolutionist's imagination. Of most of them, we have no physical evidence at all. Also, the reason that we look similar to, but not exactly like our fathers, is that we also have genetic material from our mothers, not because we have evolved. In The Magic of Reality, Dawkins states quite a few times that in science, if a model is not consistent with the evidence, it is modified or abandoned. When Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, he noted the lack of transitional fossils. He was hoping that these would be found to confirm his theory. The fact is that 150 years later, there is still a lack of transitional fossils, despite millions of fossils being found. Evolutionists still desperately cling on to their outdated theory, despite the fact that it is not consistent with the evidence. On page 44, talking about radioactive dating, Dawkins states that the different radiometric methods always agree. This is simply not true. Different methods are often out by thousands of millions of years. Dating of the Grand Canyon by the Rate Project revealed ages of between 405 and 2,574 million years, according to the potassium-argon dating method. According to the rubidium-strontium method, it was dated as 1,240 million years. The samarium-neodymium method gave an age of 1,655 million years, and the lead-lead method revealed a date of 1,883 million years. These and many other examples shows that the dating methods do not all back each other up. Dawkins seems to think that the Bible couldn't be true because it doesn't tell us how big or old the universe is, how to treat cancer, how to explain gravity or the internal combustion engine, or it doesn't tell us about germs, nuclear fusion, electricity, or anesthetics. For a start, the Bible does tell us how old the universe is. According to the Bible, the universe is about 6,000 years old. Next, it is obvious that God gave us brains to work things out for ourselves. As it says in the Bible, right from the beginning, people were intelligent. The Bible was never meant to be a science textbook, but an accurate historical record. Also, even if the Bible had given us all this amazing scientific information, from our position thousands of years later, Dawkins could just argue that the Bible had been written after people had scientifically discovered these facts. Lastly, the Bible does tell us in Genesis chapter 1 how the universe was started, where stars came from, how the earth got its water, where living creatures came from, where plants came from, why we have male and female, and why humans are different to animals, all of which came about in a supernatural way. Because these all came about supernaturally, we would expect that there would be no naturalistic explanation for them. And that is just what we find. Scientists have never been able to give any naturalistic explanation for any of these things that fully explain all the evidence. On page 142, Dawkins makes the mistake of saying that the biblical account of the flood is based on the Epic of Gilgamesh. Many myths do come about by being based on historical events, but Dawkins doesn't explain why the Jewish people would take what is obviously a mythological story and insert it into their historical record. All throughout the Bible, the Jewish people are concerned about their accurate genealogical records. Why then would they change the name of a mythological figure and insist that they were descended from him? He also doesn't explain how so many cultures all over the world that, according to Dawkins' philosophy, had been separated for many thousands of years, happened to get a similar flood account to the one in the Bible. The biblical account also gives the dimensions of the ark as being large enough to take all the animals and stable enough to float. The ark in the Gilgamesh story is a cube, which would not be stable in water. It is obvious that the Epic of Gilgamesh was just another one of the many retellings of the biblical account. The flood that happened about 4,500 years ago, as described in the Bible, gives the best explanation as to where most of the fossils come from, how we got coal and oil, how the Ice Age happened, and how rock layers were formed. When scientists attempt to answer how these things happened over millions of years, they always ignore much of the evidence. On page 123, Dawkins talks about the creation of the sun by God on the fourth day. In pretty much every culture around the world, light is associated with the sun. If, as Dawkins believes, stories are made up to explain things that people couldn't understand, it's hard for him to explain why the biblical account doesn't associate the creation of light with the creation of the sun. If the story was made up, it is much more likely it would say something like, "And God said, 'Let there be light,' and he created the sun and the moon." The fact that the light on the first 3 days is not associated with the sun shows that this account is not just made up. On page 130, Dawkins states that in 2 billion years' time, the sun will be 15% brighter than it is now, and that the temperature on Earth would be too hot for life. Dawkins fails to explain how life could have begun, as he believes, over 3 billion years ago, when the sun, according to his model, would have been much less brighter than today. The Earth would be too cold to support life. This is another example of where the biblical time frame of thousands of years easily explains the evidence, while the secular model of billions of years, as endorsed by Richard Dawkins, doesn't actually fit the facts. On pages 132 and 133, he describes how he believes the solar system was formed. This model, taking place over billions of years, does not explain why many of the planets are still giving out heat, much more than they are receiving from the sun. It also doesn't explain why many planets still have a magnetic field, despite the fact that these magnetic fields are deteriorating rapidly. It doesn't explain why many planets and moons are still geologically active, why Venus rotates in the opposite direction to the other planets, or where comets come from. These are also all examples of where the biblical model fits the facts, while the secular model can't explain the evidence. On page 135, he puts forward a theory as to how the dinosaurs died. He then makes a ridiculous statement by saying that perhaps our mammal ancestors survived years of huge earthquakes, tsunamis, and forest fires by hibernating underground. What about the birds, insects, fish, or reptiles? How did they survive? And why do so many of them look exactly as they did then? The fact that many dinosaur bones are being found with soft tissue still in them shows that dinosaurs were around till quite recently. In reality, the evidence best fits with most of the dinosaurs being wiped out in the flood of Noah about 4,500 years ago. Dawkins states on page 148 that Isaac Newton may well have been the greatest scientist ever, never mentioning that Newton believed in the biblical creation account. Newton's belief in creation never stopped him from trying to understand how things worked. Dawkins believes that miracles somehow negate science, that you can't have one with the other. This would only be true if miracles were completely random. Most miracles, however, are one-off or very rare for very specific reasons. Because of this, there is no reason why we shouldn't be able to investigate the universe around us. On page 165, he says that the predictions made on the basis of the Big Bang model of the universe keep turning out to be right. This is just not true. When scientists tried to predict the amount of matter there should be in the universe according to the Big Bang model, the figure was nowhere near what was actually observed. That is why dark matter was invented. On page 198, Dawkins says that eyes have evolved multiple times. Unfortunately for him, there is no physical evidence that shows a progression from simple to complex eyes in either the natural world or the fossil record. This is another one of the myths that Dawkins so fondly believes in. On page 201, he states that sonar has evolved at least 4 times on Earth. Likewise, this is another modern myth. There is no physical evidence that shows the evolution of sonar in any creature, let alone 4 times. Despite this book being subtitled, How We Know What's Really True, Richard Dawkins never really addresses the issue of how we know what is really true. How do we even know that we are real? How do we even know that our brains work rationally and logically? These and many other questions are never even addressed. In the chapter, Why Do Bad Things Happen?, Dawkins states, bad things happen because things happen. That is, rape, murder, and slavery aren't bad things, but just things that happen. According to Richard Dawkins' philosophy, there is nothing wrong with enslaving, raping, killing, or even eating your relations. Richard Dawkins seems to think that there should be standards and morals, but he has no basis for where these standards or morals come from. Many people think rape, murder, racism, and slavery are bad, but they cannot give a logical reason why they are bad. Richard Dawkins says that people are just an elaborate machine for passing on the genes that made them. It's funny then that the majority of people don't act like that is what they are. On page 188, Dawkins says that although there is no evidence, he believes there is probably life on millions of other planets. Despite having no scientific proof at all that chemicals can come together by themselves to form extremely complex living machines, Dawkins believes it has happened millions of times. Despite having no scientific proof that evolution has ever occurred, he believes it has happened millions of times throughout the universe. He then goes on to say that one of the great virtues of science is that when scientists don't know the answer to something, they cheerfully admit that they don't know. It's strange then that when Dawkins was asked in the interview mentioned earlier whether he could give an example of a genetic mutation or evolutionary process which could be seen to increase the information in the genome, that instead of cheerfully admitting that he didn't know the answer, he attempted to give an answer that had nothing to do with the question. Here lies the huge problem with this book, The Magic of Reality. Richard Dawkins attempts to set up a false dichotomy between science and the Bible to try and make the two mutually exclusive. According to him, he is on the side of science, where scientists seek the truth in a completely non-prejudiced way, unblinded by any particular worldview. On the other side, he thinks, are believers blinded by their own religion, unable to understand and trying to repress the scientific knowledge produced by scientists. The reality, however, is that there is no conflict between science and the Bible. The Bible gives the best explanation for all of the evidence that we have, not just some of the evidence like the secular models. The real conflict is between what we really know in science from repeatable experimentation and observations and what some scientists believe they know about the unobservable past. Scientists understand about things like atoms, animals, rainbows, and gravity because they can observe them and do experiments on them. In this way, we can say that we know things about them. On the other hand, things like the Big Bang, the origin of life, or evolution are things that have not been observed or experimented on by scientists. Therefore, when scientists say they know what happened in the past, they are really just giving their own interpretation of the evidence. There is a huge amount of evidence to examine to find out how things happened in the past, but how we interpret this evidence always depends on our worldview. Since Richard Dawkins has a naturalistic worldview, he will always attempt to give the best naturalistic answer to questions about origins, to try to find the one that best fits the evidence. Unfortunately, he never gives a rational explanation as to why he thinks there is no God, and so he gives no logical reason as to why our origins have to be naturalistic. Also, because much of the evidence cannot be explained by a naturalistic worldview, it is simply ignored. In reality, myths are not just stories invented by ancient peoples to explain the world that they lived in. There are many modern myths that after a while become so ingrained in our society that people start to believe them without question. Things like evolution, the Big Bang, dark matter, the Oort cloud, the universe being billions of years old, or aliens on other planets, are all readily believed in, despite there being no scientific proof of them. Too often people confuse what scientists know and what scientists believe because of some adherence to a particular worldview. Wikipedia gives this as a definition of religion. A religion is an organized collection of beliefs, cultural systems, and worldviews that relate humanity to an order of existence. Given the fact that Richard Dawkins has no scientific proof that life arose from non-life, or that the universe came into being by itself, it is obvious that his whole philosophy is based on a number of beliefs, and that indeed it is nothing more than just another religion. In the end, this book, The Magic of Reality, is just another religious book, not an introduction to science as it's made out to be. Too many of Richard Dawkins' scientific statements are completely wrong or have no scientific basis. Real science is concerned with what is observable and testable, where we can really know things. I, for one, would rather believe in the God of miracles and love that is described in the Bible than in the religion of Richard Dawkins that ultimately doesn't give real answers to life's questions.